in the College of Business. And I'm excited to have you here today to listen to Dr. Rajadhyaksha talk about how to navigate work-family responsibilities across the globe. Dr. Rajadhyaksha is a recognized expert in this area. She's been at GSU since 2005, 2015. That's 5 years. So she's well known in this area, doing research on the tension between balancing, work and family responsibilities. So without much ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Rajadhyaksha. But before I do that, if you have any questions, right, please type it in. There'll be 10 minutes, at the end of our presentation for her to respond to your questions. So as she's presenting, please go ahead and type in your questions and we'll get to it at the end of our presentation. So over to you, Dr. Aro.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Josie. I am so happy to be a part of the Business Week celebrations over here, and also quite excited to share, some of the work that I have done over the years on this specific topic of navigating work-family responsibilities across the globe. So I'm going to begin with a short quiz. I'm going to show you a couple of statements, and for all of those who are listening in, I'd like you to answer these statements in your own minds with a yes or a no. Answer with a yes or a no. Juggling my job, classes, and household responsibilities leaves me feeling irritable, anxious, or overworked. Yes or no? Keep that answer in your mind. Next statement. I have missed class or work because my child had the flu and there was no one available to take care of him or her. Yes or no? I have often got stressed out trying to figure out childcare options when university spring break did not coincide with my children's school break. Yes or no? I have fervently hoped that an elderly loved one's health would hold up, at least until the summer break gets here, or at least until I'm able to take leave. Yes or no? If you've answered yes to any of these statements that I just shared with you, you are not an unusual human being. You have experienced the all too common phenomenon that is referred to as work-family conflict. It is a kind of role conflict that arises when the role pressures that we experience between the work and family domains that we occupy collide or become incompatible in some respects. We all belong to families. Most of us have some form of job or other to make ends meet. And so many times the demands that we face in these two spheres don't see eye to eye. And that's when we experience work-family conflict. And sometimes this conflict can occur just because there are a limited number of hours in the day. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could expand our day indefinitely? But we've got to live with the reality that there are just 24 hours in the day. And so if you have a job that is demanding in the sense that it requires long hours, then that is going to come in the way of your ability to perhaps just be home in time for dinner. That's an example of time-based conflict. Sometimes we experience conflict because we just have a shortage of energy resources. So take the case of someone that's in a job that is quite demanding in terms of the energy required. Let's take nursing, for instance. If you're on your feet all day and you barely even have time to take lunch, that's an example of a fairly energy intensive job. Or let's take the case of, say, someone that drives a FedEx truck through a very busy route. These kinds of jobs could deplete you of energy resources so that by the time you come home, you're too exhausted to cook yourselves a fresh meal or to play with your kids. That would be an example of energy-based work-family conflict. Sometimes the conflict we face also is caused because of the fact that the behaviors that are expected in the two domains are quite contrary in nature. This is something that is often experienced particularly by women in law enforcement kinds of jobs. So as a police officer, a working mom might be expected to behave in an extremely assertive, firm, authoritarian manner, but her role at home as a mom has an expectation of more nurturant behaviors, and sometimes these two behaviors conflict with each other, and that causes work-family conflict. And nobody is really, exempted from it. We all experience it to a greater or lesser degree. Sometimes this conflict arises because it is work demands that spill over into our family lives. And sometimes it arises because our family demands spill over into our work lives. So the work family conflict that we experience is always two directional. I'm sure by this time you're left with a question in your mind as to what really causes this conflict. And it's very simple. This conflict arises because we have our work demands and our family demands interacting with each other, colliding with each other, leaving us with this uncomfortable experience over on the other side. Work demands can include a whole host of things. Long work hours, like I mentioned to you, a very physically taxing job. Shift work can be a form of work demand. If you work the graveyard shift, that certainly plays a role in increasing work-family conflict. If you don't have adequate control over the way your job is done, that can work as a work demand. On the family side, there are a whole host of factors that can contribute to your work-family conflict. So, it's been found that married persons tend to experience more work-family conflict than those that aren't married, that people who have working spouses tend to experience more work-family conflict than those that do not have, full-time working spouses. If you have dependents at home that need your care, that can act as a family demand. All the examples I gave you a while ago, having to manage the child care of your young kids while you're trying to be at work, that's an example of a family demand. If you have children at home with special needs, that can act as a family demand. So there's a whole host of things, and that keep acting on our time and energy reserves on a daily basis, that can cause us this uncomfortable experience of work-family role conflict. Now, not everything, though, between the work and family sphere has to be bad or negative. Sometimes the experiences that we have in our work and family lives can actually be positive in nature, and they could spill over in a positive manner to the other sphere. And that is something that is referred to as work-family positive spillover. And just like work-family conflict, all of us also experience a certain degree of this positive spillover. Positive spillover occurs when the experiences you have at work have a positive effect on your family life or vice versa. So let's take the case of someone that learns time management skills because of the nature of their job. That's a skill that can improve your functioning as a family member when it comes to juggling household chores. Let's take the case of someone who manages a large family, who's raised kids. Anyone that's had grown kids will know that one important skill that you learn from taking care of kids at home is patience and conflict management. Now, these are sort of invisible skills that might make you a much better employee at work because it's an experience that spills over to the workplace. So that would be an example of another kind of positive spillover. And just like work-family conflict, this spillover can happen from the work to the family side, or it could happen from the family side to the work side. I bet by this time there's some of you in the audience that are thinking, well, is there any kind of situation where I can completely minimize this work-family conflict and just be in this blissed out state where all is good? Are there any countries around the world that are, just perfectly set for work-family conflict? In fact, it's not uncommon for us to keep feeling that the grass is greener on the other side. In my interviews with employees on this topic, I've often found employees, particularly in the United States, constantly feeling that employees in Asia have it easier because they live in extended families. So they have sort of free childcare just sort of built into their daily system and their daily lives. And then on the other hand, when you speak with employees on the other side of the globe, they're often looking towards North America with some envy and thinking, well, you know, employees on the other side of the globe, they have rights. Their companies offer them so many real, actual supports in the form of childcare facilities, creches. In those countries, you have elder care facilities, you have hospice care. Whereas in our country, all of these responsibilities fall on family members to take care of. So there's always this feeling that the grass is greener on the other side, people on the other side of the planet have it easier than you. And as a result of this constant narrative that hovers around, a bunch of us researchers decided a couple of years ago to examine culture's consequences on this issue of work-family conflict. What happens if you study work-family conflict in different parts of the world? What are the results you can expect or hope to see? And so what happened was a bunch of us came together and we conducted this 10 country study. Our goal in this study was to examine how a country's culture can moderate or change the way in which those work and family demands can affect your work conflict, as well as the positive experiences that you have between your work and family lives. And the countries that we studied included the following. There was Australia, Canada, and the United States. These were countries that fell in the Anglo, Western kind of orientation countries. Then there were a couple of Asian countries, which included China, India, Indonesia, and Taiwan. And then there were a few countries from the Middle Eastern region that included Israel, Turkey, and Spain. And this was, a multi-country collaborative study that went over several years. Results of the study were ultimately published in the form of a book, and that's the cover of the book you see right there. When these countries were being selected for the research, the goal was to try and ensure that we sampled employees across a whole host of what you could call broadly gender regimes, because a lot of work-family conflict depends on the extent to which you have women in the workplace, since traditionally, family roles have always been the responsibility of women. So we wanted to ensure that you got a good spread of countries on that dimension. And there was also another criterion that determined the selection of these countries, and that was the extent to which employees, working people in that country relied upon formal versus informal supports for balancing your work and family lives. So in the more developed countries, you tended to have more formal kinds of organizations offering you support for work-family balance, whereas in the less developed, more Asian countries, you tended to have less informal supports that came from the family and the communities. So we wanted to make sure we also got a spread of those different kinds of supports on work-family conflict. And now I come to the exciting part, which is the results that we found from this extensive study. I'm going to begin with some of the findings that were similar across countries. One overwhelming finding was that work-family conflict is largely detrimental to employees all over the globe, no matter where you live. Work-family positive spillover, on the other hand, is beneficial. It has many, many positive outcomes for employees at the individual level as well as at the organizational level. So conflict, bad; positive spillover, good. That was one, resounding result that came across all of the countries that we studied. Another result that emerged from the study was that job control, if that could be enhanced in some way, then it had the positive effect of being associated with more positive spillover from your work life to your family life. If you allow an employee to have more control over the way they get work done in their job, they're going to feel good, and some of that goodness is going to spill over into their family life. And conversely, family control was positively associated with good spillover from the family world to the work world. A third result that was common across all of the countries we studied was that employees that were satisfied with family-friendly work policies demonstrated positive outcomes. Satisfaction with these policies was associated with lower levels of conflict. It was also associated with what we'd call lower turnover intentions. In other words, employees that were happy with the family-friendly support they got in the workplace were less likely to look for other jobs because all that flexibility and support that they needed came to them right there from their work sphere. Now, this is an interesting finding. Greater social support from the spouse was associated with lower work-family conflict no matter where you lived. And I say this is interesting because we studied social support from all kinds of sources, from the work sphere, from your boss, from your coworker, from your supervisor, from the family sphere, from your parents, in-laws, friends, family, extended family, relatives, community members, even children. The only source of social support that came out as being significantly associated with lower levels of conflict across the globe, no matter where you lived, was support from your spouse. So that's something to keep in mind. And then setting priorities at work was associated with lower work-family conflict. So if you were an employee that knew how to prioritize all the demands that you were facing at work, you were probably doing the right thing, and that was going to place you in a good position to experience lower conflict. What were the findings that were different across countries? Now, you remember the goal of this study was to see how culture changed the ways in which work overload and family overload caused work-family conflict. And so these are some of the differences we found across countries. When it came to Anglo cultures, or countries that were more individualistic in nature, countries that lay greater emphasis on individual rights over the rights of the group, employees belonging to these countries had a situation where it was really their workload that was contributing heavily to work-family conflict. On the other hand, if you were an employee residing in one of the Eastern countries, the Asian countries that are more collectivistic in their culture, where there is greater emphasis and value placed on the group, on your family, on your community, relative to yourself as an individual, then it was very likely that it was things happening within the family that were causing your work-family conflict. So we clearly saw this pattern where factors in different spheres were responsible for creating conflict for people in different parts of the world. Some more interesting findings across countries. We found that employees in Asian countries benefited much more from having job control and family control compared to employees in the Western countries. We also found that employees in the Anglo-European countries, on the other hand, benefited from a different set of strategies when it came to reducing work-family conflict. And that strategy was prioritizing at home and at work, but not trying to do it all. So, trying to be a superman or a superwoman would not work in your interest, particularly if you were an employee in the Western part of the world. Some more interesting cross-cultural findings across the work sphere. Impact of job schedule. In general, full-time employees tended to be stressed all over the globe. They tended to have high levels of work-family conflict, whether you were working in Indonesia or Israel or Canada. But the negative impact of this full-time work was felt more greatly in the Eastern non-Anglo-Asian countries as compared to the Western countries. And this was especially true for conflict arising from the family that spilled over into your work sphere. So that kind of supported this overall orientation that we had seen, that in Asian countries, it is really family factors that cause your conflict relative to countries located on the other side of the hemisphere. Some more interesting cross-cultural findings with regard to the work sphere. So employees that worked in large organizations in the Eastern countries, they tended to report lesser satisfaction with their lives. But at the same time, they also reported lesser work interference with family compared to employees in large organizations in the West. And this was probably because many of the large organizations in the Asian countries that we studied tended to be older organizations. They also tended to be large government organizations. Older organizations, government organizations, tend to have better support systems for employees. And so therefore it kind of makes sense that they were able to offer all the help that their employees needed. At the same time, though, they can be very bureaucratic, and that probably explains why these employees also experienced lesser overall life satisfaction at the same time. Impact of family systems. So now we're looking at some cross-cultural findings with regard to the other sphere, the family sphere. So this is probably not a very surprising finding, but it's interesting that it came out so clearly in our data. Employees that lived in the Anglo-Western countries, and these included Australia, Canada, Israel, Spain, and the United States, especially those employees that lived in extended families, they experience significantly lesser life satisfaction or positive work-family experiences compared to employees that lived in extended families in the East. And this once again sort of is telling about the greater value and love and emphasis placed on extended family systems in Eastern cultures relative to Western cultures. And then we look at also the impact of having a working spouse and how did that impact your work-family conflict depending on which side of the globe you lived in. So let's begin with the Western side of the globe. A full-time working spouse tended to increase the extent to which work interfered with your family life in the West as compared to the East, especially because of time-based challenges. At the same time, a full-time working spouse also decreased the extent to which your family matters interfered with your work life in the West as compared to the East. And a full-time working spouse significantly increased your life satisfaction in the West as compared to the East. So, if your spouse was working full-time like you, between the two of you, you clearly had a lot of challenges of juggling schedules. There were a lot of challenges due to the fact that you have limited time to see each other, to plan things and so on. But as a result of both spouses working full-time, there was also perhaps a tendency to simplify things in the family sphere. So the extent to which your family tasks spilled over and interfered with your work life was much lower. And in general, perhaps because of the larger resources that the family gained from having two full-time working spouses, you in general experience greater life satisfaction. So what seems to be the implication of this is that in work-oriented, individualistic cultures of the Western Anglo countries, having a full-time working spouse brings with it benefits as well as challenges. Now, how did the working status of the spouse impact the work-family conflict of employees in the East? In the East, what you found was that if you had a non-working spouse, that increased the extent to which your family matters interfered with work as compared to people with non-working spouses in the West. Conversely, if you had a non-working spouse and you lived in an Asian country, you also at the same time experienced a lot of positive work-family spillover. What does this mean? This means that just as in the West, a full-time working spouse kind of presented a double-edged sword in terms of work-family experiences, in the East, it was a non-working spouse that presented the similar double-edged sword of work-family experiences. A non-working spouse brought some benefits with them because you experience an overall positive work-family spillover, an overall sense of well-being. But at the same time, it also brought a lot of challenges because many family factors started interfering with your own work life. Moving on to some interesting cross-cultural findings on the individual side. Impact of age. In general, younger people tended to experience higher work-family conflict wherever they lived. And by younger people, I mean employees below the age of 35 years. Older participants, on the other hand, tended to have higher conflict only in the West as compared to the East. Impact of the age of the youngest child. Employees that had younger children, children that were in the toddler age group, preschool children, they tended to experience higher uh, degrees of family factors interfering with your work life compared to employees having older kids, no matter where you lived. So both in the East as well as the West, young parents were having a hard time. Impact of education. The more educated you were, the higher was your work interference with family conflict, both in the East as well as the West. However, more educated participants reported significantly higher intentions to leave their jobs in the East as compared to the West. And this may have had to do with the fact that we studied Eastern economies that were going through a growth boom. And so higher levels of education also probably presented you with more work opportunities, increasing your tendency to job hop, especially if you were having a hard time in your current job in terms of work-family conflict. And then we also studied the impact of the strength of religious beliefs and how that impacts your work-family conflict. And we found that both in the East as well as in the West, employees that had stronger religious beliefs also tended to experience higher levels of positive work-family spillovers. It didn't reduce work-family conflict, but it did increase your sense of well-being. And then one cross-cultural difference that we found was that employees that reported weaker religious beliefs also reported lower levels of their family life interfering with their work life, but this was true only for the West, not so much for the East. So it seems like in the East, because there's a higher salience placed on family, family tends to intrude into your work life to a greater degree, no matter what, whereas in the West, where there's greater emphasis on work, it's a lot of work factors that impact your work family life and balance. So what does this mean? Clearly, the grass is not greener on the other side. Clearly, there is no one culture that is perfect for reducing work family conflict. Different factors cause conflict in the West versus the East. And at the same time, though, there are some things that stay the same. And so if anyone's ever had that experience of being envious of employees in other countries or other parts of the world, I hope this reassures you that everyone's having an equally good or equally bad time. It's a matter of figuring out what are the factors that are causing the conflict in the context that you are in, and what are the factors that can play a role in minimizing that conflict and maximizing your positive work-family experiences wherever you're at. So what does this mean then for work-family interventions? How do you really manage across different cultures and contexts? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that obviously these work-family conflicts and positive experiences are arising in different ways at different levels. Some of these experiences are arising because of things happening in your family. Some of them are arising at work. Some of them are arising because of larger societal cultural factors. So if we're going to try and minimize your work-family conflict experiences, then these interventions have also to be multi-level. They've got to arise or originate from the family world, from the world of work, as well as at the governmental or societal levels. Let's look at some things you need to specifically do in the work organization. You need to continue with those family-friendly workplace policies. Not all organizations employ them. A few of them do. Those that don't, they should be encouraged to offer them. You need to not just provide these broad policies, but also train co-workers and supervisors to be family-friendly and supportive. You need to offer employees overall corporate cultures that are family friendly, because supervisors and workers are not going to have any incentives to be family friendly if the larger company culture isn't family friendly to begin with. You also need to have much more of a results-based culture rather than a face-time culture. So if employees can be encouraged to show the results, regardless of where, when, and how they are performing their job, as long as those job standards get preserved, that could play a role in minimizing work-family conflict. Given that satisfaction with family-friendly policies was important for employee well-being, organizations would need to get into a habit of regularly surveying their employees about their satisfaction levels. And so this has a direct implication for the HR function. And you would also want to coach and train your employees to learn to prioritize responsibilities, particularly at work, because of this overwhelming result that those that knew how to prioritize work demands tended to have relatively lower levels of conflict than those that were just a mess with all the challenges that they were facing at work. On the family side, you would want to encourage family support to ease family demands. And this would be interesting and relevant also to the Western sphere. So rather than looking for ways to minimize interactions with family and restricting them just to a couple of holidays in the year, perhaps it might be beneficial to cultivate more supportive family relationships, reducing family overload by just simplifying family tasks and household chores, trying to use technology effectively to handle some of these to the extent that is possible could certainly play a role in minimizing work-family conflict. Increasing family control through flexibility as to how, when, and by whom work is done. And that's critical because the distribution of household chores across cultures continues to be very gendered. And so if policies can be put in place at the governmental level, at the societal level, to dislodge some of this pervasive genderedness that we see of household chores, that could play a role in reducing work-family conflict. And particularly for Asian cultures, if families could be encouraged to adopt work-friendly family practices, just as work organizations adopt family-friendly work practices. So we are asking for a reversal of the same phenomenon, but with regard to the family sphere in Asian cultures, then that can certainly play a role in perhaps enabling more balance between the work and family spheres. And finally, at the governmental level, you need to push governments to offer more paid leaves for family responsibilities. You need to push governments to offer more flexible work arrangements, more part-time work with full-time benefits, more childcare and elder care services, because it emerged that no matter where you lived, young parents have a harder time, older employees have a harder time, those who are working full-time have a harder time. And so if we were to pull all of this together to conclude, what kinds of work-family interventions or approaches we should be using to navigate work-family responsibilities across cultures, you want to begin by, first of all, having work-family interventions that are multi-level, that exist at the organizational, family, as well as societal levels. You want to try and keep these in alignment with each other so that they are not tugging and pulling in opposite directions, because that's the only way that you can really move the needle on work-family conflict. What this study also suggested was that work-family interventions may need to be customized to the culture and context. And if in a particular country there's a deficiency of supports at one level, that might be compensated for by more supports at another level. So if in a particular country you do not have support, from the government in the form of paid leave for family responsibilities, then organizations may need to step up and fill that gap. And that brings me to the last point, which is that the organizational context has to constantly be studied as a part of this intervention process. Organizations, businesses across the globe will have to find creative ways to play that compensatory role. In Asian cultures particularly, this would need to be highly creative because a lot of the demands that are being placed on employees are coming from your family life. So organizations and businesses will have to look for creative ways to encourage families to make things more simple in the family sphere, to distribute responsibilities more equitably in the family sphere, but without being too intrusive, because ultimately the family sphere is a more private sphere. It's not the same way in which an HR department can provide incentives for employees to, experiment with work family supports in the work sphere. It's a completely different kind of a domain. And that's where the creativity of HR departments is going to be challenged. At the larger societal level, in Asian cultures, you might need to have more educational campaigns to get people to be more cognizant of the ways in which family challenges the work-family balance of working men and women. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation, and I would be happy to take questions and have a discussion going if there is one.
Yes, Dr. Rajadhyasksha, that was quite interesting. I didn't know there was such a divergence, right? Interventions across, different parts of the world. I mean, I learned a lot just listening to you. So, like Dr. Aru said, if you have any questions, could you just post it, and she'll be happy to, answer the question. Well, let me start with my question, right? So I have a question for you. Yep. So what do you think will be the impact of COVID-19 and working virtually, right, on work family, the tension, right, and how could governments intervene, right, with COVID in the background?
This is an excellent question. For all this while, we've been shouting from the rooftops for companies to offer more flexible work policies. And now all of a sudden, thanks to COVID, everyone's arms were more or less twisted into offering this work from home opportunity. And it's interesting because throughout there was this belief that working from home is going to be this solution to everything bad happening to employees in the form of work-family conflict. Now, what's becoming evident though, even in the preliminary research that is coming out with regard to work-family conflict during COVID, is that it is certainly overwhelming one gender of employees, and that is women. And that takes us back to the point that has been made before, which is that the distribution of chores within the family sphere has stayed very sticky, very much in the domain of women. Whether you're talking of very developed countries like Sweden and Norway, or you're talking of Asian countries that historically have been traditional, or even countries that are more in the middle of the spectrum like Spain. And so you would like to believe that this would be a fantastic way out, but it is a piecemeal offering in the absence of other supports. So if you don't have those childcare supports, which we aren't having right now in the middle of COVID, if you don't have those elder care supports, if you don't have those supports for balancing household chores more equitably, then it's not going to make a significant difference. It might, in fact, actually overburden working women employees.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. Let me just answer a follow-on question, right? So to what extent, will the capability of a government, right, mediate the ability to intervene, right, in a positive way, right, maybe to reinforce, the husband or the wife, to help to reduce that tension. Because I would suspect that, government capability has an impact here.
Yeah. That is an excellent question, and one that we keep asking ourselves even when we meet for conferences, because the government can shape behaviors within families through incentives and through policies of education. Because it is a private sphere, unless you're in a very authoritarian regime, you cannot dictate a change of values, but you can induce a change of behaviors systematically through a campaign of highlighting the benefits to all members of the family through a more equitable distribution of work-family roles. And that can only come through wider public policy campaigns. And this is something that is done not necessarily to a very strong degree, and it kind of becomes a bit sticky because it can change also based on what is the overall value orientation of the government that is in power. So people that do look at changes in gender distribution of work find that depending on which cohort you're talking about and what was happening at the macro level in that country politically, you can see an impact on how many women are able to stay in the workforce, how many women end up dropping out of the workforce because of high responsibilities at home. So what can governments do? They can do a lot, provided there is a political will. That's the bottom line.
That's interesting. So since there are no questions are coming, let's follow and ask you some more questions. Right. So, why should a private sector company be interested in work-family conflict? I mean, what's the value proposition for a private sector company to okay, you know what? Let's push the government. Let's within the company itself, let's make some accommodation. Why should the company care about that?
That's a great question. And here's the reason why they should do that. Because there's overwhelming research now that employees that experience high levels of conflict tend to show negative outcomes that impact the workplace. One common negative outcome is high turnover. And a tendency to start looking for new jobs that allow you to do this balance much better. And after you've spent all that time in recruiting employees, training them, bringing them up to speed, if you don't offer them that work-family support, they're going to start looking around, and that would be one strong reason to offer all of this support, because you're going to be able to keep them with you so that you can invest further in them to make them the best employees that you need. So all of those negative outcomes. There are also a lot of negative outcomes at the personal level. There's a high level of negative psychological health as well as physical health, which can be correlated with absenteeism. And that can have a negative impact on a business's, productivity. So another reason why HR departments might want to consider offering more work-family support.
That's interesting. So there's a benefit for the government, there's a benefit for corporations. Mm-hmm. Let's look at the individual. Well, why should individuals in their families, why should they be concerned? Why should a husband and wife seek to make accommodation between themselves to accommodate one or the other so both of them can either work and one stays home? What's in it for the individual at that level?
That is really also a very interesting question. So one simple answer to that is, even if you look at the results that came from this study, employees that had full-time working spouses reported higher levels of life satisfaction. And so there is some kind of a benefit. It might seem very invisible, it's slow, it's insidious, but there is a benefit, no doubt, especially in this day and age of both spouses being actively employed in the work sphere as well as the family sphere. By default, you are engaged in the family sphere when you are a married couple, but why should both try and engage in the work sphere? Because there are learnings that you gain from being out there in the work sphere, which you bring to your family self, and which, provided you have all the support, can enhance the experience that you're having within the family, can enhance your overall life satisfaction, not to mention the higher monetary resources that you're able to bring in if both partners are able to be gainfully employed.
Thank you, Dr. Rajadhyaksha. That was a very, very interesting and very, very informative. And to the audience, if you're here, to listen to Dr. Jang talk about facial recognition, machine learning and marketing, please stay. But if you are here or if you're interested in the other presentation by Dr. Coken on impact of systemic supply chain disruptions on shareholders' wealth, please go. The link is on the website. It's also on your invitation. So please go there if you're interested in that. If you want to listen to Dr. Jang, please stay. And if you come here, right, from Dr. Kreis's presentation, you're welcome. We'll start in the next few minutes.
Thank you.